here to talk about the fourth industrial revolution. Who's heard of such a thing? All right. You've all heard about it, and I'm actually not going to talk about the fourth industrial revolution for two reasons. One, I think it's a misnomer, and I'm going to come back and talk about that in a moment. But secondly, I think actually it's less interesting to talk about what's going on with the revolution than it is what to do about it, how to react to it, and how to make sense of everything that's coming at us in this time that is actually different from anything else that we have seen before. So my hope over the next roughly 25, 30 minutes or so is to hit on just two very simple, practical pieces of advice that all of you can keep in your minds over the course of the next 3 days. You're going to be bombarded with information and bombarded with all sorts of interesting and scary and hopefully energetic information about the way the world is changing. But I'm trying to set in place just two fundamentals that as you go through those experiences and you think about how to bring this back into your businesses and actually make money from it, both in the short term and the long term, you can. So here's the misnomer bit. I'm sure all of you have seen some version of this slide before, and depending on how you describe or set time frames around previous industrial revolutions, we have gone through roughly 3 other times of pretty significant change when the world around us, especially for manufacturers, has changed. And we're going through that now. You can call the current time the connected revolution, you can call it the smart automation revolution, you can call it a lot of different things, but what's fundamentally different now, and what makes this not just another revolution and not simply a continuous part of what you see on this slide, is the pace of change. In the past, every single time we've gone through one of these revolutions, information has come at us at a reasonable pace. We can look at, see what's happening in the world, we can react, we can shift our operations accordingly, and we can get on with things. And that's not to make it sound like it's easy. It has always been hard to react to change, but we have been able to handle it because things have progressed in a reasonably linear fashion. You're going to be hearing lots more about exponentials and the impact of exponential trends over the course of the next 3 days. But that's happening now. And I can tell you that you won't be able to keep up. Every single one of us, myself included, are not wired to keep up and to think about the nature of change and the pace of change and to be able to react and shift our operations accordingly. We can't act and react like we have in the past. It's just moving too fast. And so my hope over the course of these days, as you look for those practical pieces of advice, is that you not try to absorb every single bit of information about technologies coming at you, but that you see it all through a lens of practical application. Because the reality is, most of you are not going to last that long, either in your jobs or at your company, because your companies won't exist. Again, many of you have probably seen some version of this slide before. If you can't read it from the back there, this is the average lifespan of a company listed in the S&P 500. So it goes back to 1960, I believe, and it's over a 7-year rolling average. So it's not just simply what happened in that individual year. There are certainly some cycles to this, but I'm guessing all of you can see the downward trend. And whereas it used to be a great gig 60 years ago or 70 years ago, 60, to be in the S&P 500 because you knew you'd be around for 50 or 60 years, it's not that great a gig anymore. If you look at where we're falling today, we're, roughly 20 years is the average lifespan, and that's going down. I actually don't know how to describe the uptick here at the end. We'll see if that ends up taking place. But that's the reality of the world we're living in. And I hope that every single one of you, working as most of you do in large, established, really successful corporations, understand that what's happened in the past isn't going to be what happens in the future. And the reason that this is on a steady decline and why it's on such a precipitous decline over the next few years is because of the nature of exponential change and the fact that we are not wired as humans to keep up with it and to do something about it. So I want to start with a graphic which, for those of you that know me, and I apologize for the lopped off L there, are probably bored of hearing me talk about, but this is a bit of research that we did about 5 years ago. Harvard Business Review was nice enough to give us the cover of their magazine about the observation that we had at the time. I am not going to bore you with the details of how we did it and what we did and how we did it and what the totality of the results were, but the key punchline that came out of that research was that if you want to out-earn your peers in the capital markets, if you're a big, established public company, and you're looking for ways to demonstrate to investors that you're great at innovation, you can't just do 1 or 2 moonshots. You have to be able to work across a whole spectrum of levels of ambition behind innovation. And what we discovered through the research is that, on average, across industries, across companies, et cetera, if you're spending about 70% of your time innovating in your core business, so taking your existing set of products and optimizing them for your existing customers, sometimes edging a little bit into new customer segments or trying new things, but 70% of your activity in the core, 20% in the adjacent space, so stretching your asset base, trying to serve customers in different ways, or trying new technologies to serve existing customers, and 10% in that transformational space where you're genuinely trying to discover customer and market needs before they can ever tell you them themselves. If you can get that balance right, and as I said, on average, it was 70, 20, 10. Interestingly, the return from that innovation system was virtually the inverse, where 70% of what you earn from your innovation system over a 3 to 5 year period came from the few big bets in the transformational space, 20% in the adjacent space, from the adjacent space, and 10% from the core. So this is what our research told us 5 years ago. And there's all sorts of challenges I have with the research. This has now been called the golden ratio of innovation, but actually the point of the article was to say, have a strategic conversation to decide what the right ratio is for you. Don't just follow the 70, 20, 10 blindly. But I've discovered 2, and I think now increasingly a 3rd, what I'll call universal rule, as I've been out talking to executive teams and exploring companies on this topic. The first is that no one has any clue where their spend is today. Like, no joke. Even the best financially managed companies in the world, you go to the executive team and you say, where do you think you're focusing your attention today? Just give me an estimate. Let's not pull out the books and look at the numbers. Just give me an estimate. And the guesses are all over the board. It's just not something that a lot of companies track. And related to that, the second universal rule I've discovered is everyone way overestimates the degree to which they're operating outside their core, or trying to innovate outside their core business. And we actually, sometimes people ask us to come in and root around and try to figure out what the balance of a portfolio is today, and I can tell you the times we've done that, it's been like 95 or 96 or 97% of the activity and the spend in the system is focused on the core, with only a few little attempts to stretch into the adjacent space, and very, very rarely get into the transformational space. So, interesting bit of research from 5 years ago. And it hasn't changed that much. The practical application of this, if you want to think about how to frame the opportunities in front of you in this so-called 4th industrial revolution, is this simplified version of this chart. And so the way to look at this is you just draw a line from the top left to the bottom right here, and it splits the world in half between 2 types of opportunities you can be pursuing. Below the line, you've got the known or the knowable opportunities, the stuff that you can go into a market and say to a customer, a prospective customer, do you like this? How much will you buy, and what will you pay? And you're going to get pretty good data back. They may not always tell you the truth, but you can get pretty good data because it's a world that they can imagine. It's a market that exists today. And for this, you can use all sorts of traditional management techniques like quantitative surveys and getting information from your sales force and whatever you want to use to get signals as to what's going to be relevant in the market because it's in the here and now. The stuff above the line, though, by definition, is unknown, and in some cases, unknowable. So the top right of this matrix is defined by the notion that customers can't even predict themselves what they're going to be looking for because they can't imagine the way that the world is going to change, or they can't imagine the way that their operations are going to change. And what we've discovered over time, and it's not exactly a blinding insight, but it happens in every single company we talk to, is you cannot ask your existing business units and businesses that have been structured to do the below-the-line stuff for years and years and usually get pretty good at it to go try to work above the line. You just can't. It takes different people, it takes different metrics, it takes different funding mechanisms. And that's all fine and good when, in the world of 5 years ago, like 85 or 90% of what you need to do is below the line. That's fine. If 85% of what you're focused on is in the here and now, You don't need new and different structures. You don't need ways of interpreting the signals from the world to try to identify where opportunities are. But that has changed. And so the third universal rule that I think I'm now starting to understand is my research is old and bad. 70-20-10 no longer applies. And I have no idea what the right numbers are now, but I'm pretty sure it's something more like 50-30-20. Or I have a hard time imagining that the people shouldn't be spending half their innovation efforts in optimizing their core, but maybe it's 50-25-25. Maybe it's even more aggressively out and to the right. But that then defines a world where you are needing to set up completely different structures to, as I said before, interpret the signals of the world and identify what we should be focusing on next. So that's the dilemma. How do you, as big, successful companies, and I've seen the guest list here, I'd say virtually every single one of you is big and successful and great at what you do. How do you do things differently to operate above the line? And that obviously is one of the purposes of this conference. So this is a picture of the, as the researchers put it, the big data landscape of 2017. And you can see all sorts of blurred out colors and images up here. These are all the logos of the companies that are populating the various different spaces, whether it's machine learning or advertising or stat tools or financial and economic data. And there's many more out there than these ones. These are all the technologies I'm not going to be talking about today, in part because I actually don't think they're as relevant as the points I now want to go to in the fundamentals, and in part because, honestly, I'm not qualified to talk about it. I'm a strategist, not a technologist, so I'd get myself in deep trouble if I tried to venture into that territory. But I want to start with a fundamental that's directly related to this chart. So as you may have seen in the subtitle on the first page of this, the subtitle of this was I actually can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like how to understand opportunity, how to take action and see through the fog of opportunity. And what I meant by that is not just the literal fogging out of these brand names, but there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of technology applications and startups and all sorts of people in the market out there ready to help you go and do something digital. And for a little while, the natural reaction has been the following sequence of events when you try to think about how to innovate with digital technology. You look out into that landscape and you say, what's out there? What technologies exist today? What applications of technologies exist today that we could take advantage of, and how might we use them? We know about sensors. Should we put sensors onto our machines? That might be an interesting move. And then the next step is to say, okay, cool. So if we've got sensors on our machines, how can we use advanced analytics or artificial intelligence and machine learning? How can we get more insights about the way things are working? And then ultimately, when that all plays out, how do things change in the market? How do behaviors change, whether they're customer behaviors or people in our operations? And that's a pretty logical approach. You take a look at the technologies at your disposal and go figure out how to apply them. There's too many. You can't do that. I don't care what intelligence systems you have to keep track of all the digital technologies or all the startups in the world. You can't take that approach. You can't just go say, geez, there's this interesting startup. What would it look like if we played it through our business system? So I'd like to encourage you all, as the first fundamental here, not to pay attention to technology as the first step, but instead start with humans and start with human behavior. And I'm going to say something now which sounds tremendously kind of consultancy, geeky, and I'm sorry, but I just don't know any other way to say it. If you look at your operations today, everything from, and let's break it down into two worlds of trying to drive top-line growth or trying to drive efficiency in your operations. Neither of those outcomes today, and I would argue for the foreseeable future, neither of those outcomes is possible without someone somewhere changing their behavior, like literally their physical behavior, sometimes a thought process, but usually a physical behavior. You cannot drive growth in your end markets unless someone decides to buy you instead of a competitor. or if they decide to use your product differently than they've used it in the past. That's the only way that you unleash incremental growth. And likewise, in your operations, you can't get more efficient unless someone does something differently. They stop doing one activity, they start doing another. That actually brings this whole world of unknowable application of opportunity into the knowable space. You can identify the behaviors in your system, which I think of as the kind of the key economic gears of your business, the way that value is created, whether it's top-line growth or efficiency. You can identify the behaviors in the market that will give you economic advantage and create new economic value. And so the trick now is to identify what behavioral shifts will have the greatest economic value for us, which ones we should focus on and prioritize because they have so much value embedded in them, and from there, pull it back and to say, okay, so how do we use data and insights to track those behavioral shifts and see if they're actually, when we impact a behavior, see if they're having the effect that we imagine they are, and see if there's a way that we can course correct along the way so that we optimize those behaviors. And then the question should become, okay, based on that, what technologies do we want to use? So it obviously doesn't mean you can't be completely ignorant of the range of technologies or applications that exist out there, but it shouldn't be the place you start. It should be the place that you end up. And if you follow that logic, and if you set up your systems where you can identify the behaviors and then use technology to impact them in the way you want, I can promise you, you're going to get greater return from your digital innovation than if you do it in reverse. So there are three basic ways that we can break down human behavior and where the opportunity to create value from human behavior exists. And I will say I'm venturing into territory. I know at least two of these companies are here in the room, maybe all three, and I'm always nervous about trying to tell other people's stories, so stand up and yell at me if I'm getting it wrong. But think about breaking down the opportunity to impact human behavior into three different buckets. Starting from the left, you can drive different outcomes in your own operations. You can change the way that people act while they work within your operations. You can change outcomes for your immediate downstream customers. Almost all of you in this room are quote-unquote B2B, which, by the way, I think is increasingly an irrelevant term, but B2B, where you're actually selling to, not to end markets necessarily, but usually to another customer in the value chain. But you can change outcomes for those downstream customers. And then you can change outcomes in the end market. Okay, so I've got three simple examples here of companies, and this is all public domain information, by the way. It's nothing that we have done necessarily. But three simple examples of companies, which some of it's going to seem totally obvious, but seen through the lens of behavioral change, I think it's an interesting way to look at what they've done and to diagnose how they had the impact we had. So the first one here is Nissan, and their use of what they call them cobots, collaborative robots. You can call it whatever you want, RPA, cobots, whatever the term may be. The place they started was a recognition that, for a variety of different reasons, some of which I don't even know, they were facing an aging workforce. It was a long-term trend, and it was going to continue. And so the question they had was not, how can I get folks in my operations to do things differently, but how do I stop them from doing things? How do I stop them from doing the repetitive tasks that might actually be harder to do as aging goes on, or might actually cause detriment to my workers? How do I stop them from doing the complicated physical maneuvers that actually will become more difficult to do as those workers age? And those were the types of questions that they were asking as they thought about the application of RPA for their plant settings. And what they came up with were these solutions where these so-called cobots, where they could do some of the highly repetitive picking or turning of screws, or whatever the case may be. And what they're able to do with that is not only drive efficiency through their process, but prevent worker absence, and therefore save money in two different ways, and, by the way, react to the reality of their aging workforce, all of which was accomplished by a simple move, which they could have presumably said, okay, how do I deploy RPA in my operations? And they may have come to the same place, but I bet you they would have tried all sorts of other applications before they got at the one that actually created the economic value that cobots did for them. So the second story is from Caterpillar, and I want to encourage you to think about slicing this page roughly down the middle. And this is for rough purposes for sure, but the stuff on the left-hand side is generally about creating efficiencies and reducing cost. The stuff on the right-hand side is mainly about generating top-line growth. And the challenge that I've seen in a lot of my manufacturing clients is it's pretty easy to think about the application of technology to drive efficiency and to shift your operations. It's much more difficult to think about how to apply it for growth. But I think both these examples of Caterpillar and United Technologies are interesting examples of where they have been able to drive real top-line growth from it. So the story from Caterpillar is actually a very timely one because it has to do with their relationship with a company called Yard Club, which many of you may have seen, I think, 2 years ago. I know we've got some Caterpillar folks in the audience, but did I just say years? 2 weeks ago, Caterpillar just completed an acquisition, completed the acquisition of Yard Club. And again, it started with a reasonably non-intuitive move. Caterpillar wanted people to stop buying their machines. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But actually, the other half of the sentence is that they wanted customers to stop buying their machines and start renting them instead. Because the way that Caterpillar, not overall, but the way that Caterpillar drives economic value and margin from their business is not just in selling big pieces of yellow capital equipment. It's in selling all the work tools and attachments to that afterwards. It's in selling the parts to those machines. And the insight they had is, yeah, we may lose a few machine sales if people start renting instead of buying, but if we can drive usage of our machines by creating an efficient market for those machines, and we can drive the throughput of our work tools and our parts, that actually is going to have better economic value for us than the potential loss of sales of the big pieces of capital equipment. And so they took a small position in an interesting, tiny little startup out in California, and what the startup had was an app. It was just a market-making app. There's thousands of these things in evidence around the world today that connected people who had construction machines with potential renters. That's all it did. And that was the key to them then getting into the rental market and driving this business model. That, again, they may have been able to approach this and say, geez, we should set up a rental app. But that could also have been one of 50 other things. We should do this app or that app. The key insight there was they knew that driving rental would be the key to driving the economics in their business, and that's why 2 weeks ago they completed the acquisition of Yard Club. So United Technologies, I realize, like usual, I'm taking a little bit longer than intended, so I'm going to speed up a bit. But United Technologies over on the right-hand side here, aerospace systems, another interesting example of a company driving growth from the application of technology. And the basic story here is United Technologies understood that they could drive both brand adherence, if you will, and better use of their systems in their airline customers if they could get the users of those airplanes to do things differently, and importantly, to work more efficiently, to increase on-time performance, to do all the types of things that generally we don't believe airlines do very well and make us hate airlines. They wanted to flip that around and look for ways that they could get information into the hands of the people operating the planes, the pilots, the crew, to do things differently to improve performance. And so what they established was their Ops Insight platform, which sits on an iPad. Pilots can tap into it and understand real-time performance information, as well as all sorts of other information, weather, what have you, that would allow them to make decisions in the moment, pre-flight, during flight, and post-flight, to improve the experience of their customers, of the passengers flying on the plane. And so this ultimately is something that was enabled by United Technologies being able to get the right information through the system onto the iPad at the right time, but ultimately it was driven by a desired behavior in the end market. United Technologies could think to themselves, you know what, we serve airlines. Let's try to think about how we optimize the performance of our aerospace systems for those airlines. And not think the next 1 or 2 steps down the value chain, because that's how most manufacturing and B2B companies think. But that's not what they did. And again, this created an interesting new business model and a whole lot of satisfaction amongst their customers. Anyway, that's perhaps a bit long on the tooth version of fundamental number 1. But I do think it's actually the meatiest thing as you think about all these exponentials that you're going to be assailed with over the next few days. Think about how you're going to change human behavior with those technologies. Don't think about the technologies themselves. Learn and all that. Obviously, I'm not saying don't pay attention to it, but think about the application to drive behavior. So the second fundamental is actually going to be totally obvious and straightforward to all of you, and I'm not sure how many people saw the economists, I think it was last week, declaring that data may be the new big oil. So their premise, for those of you that didn't see it, was that in previous industrial revolutions and X number of decades ago, the captains of industry, those who were the business leaders, were those that were able to control access to and production of oil. And that because that was so embedded in the economics of the business world generally. Then so the economist asks, is big data the new oil? Are we now getting into an age when accessing and controlling and providing data is going to be one of the key engines for the economy? And I would argue, yeah, probably. And the interesting question they asked also in some of their coverage was, where will the wildcatters come from? Where will the people who were surrounding you to try to help with this or to take advantage of the data before you as big corporates recognize it yourself, where are they going to be coming from over time? So the basic premise behind Fundamental 2 just has to do with where you all, as manufacturers, sit in the value chain. Whatever value chain you operate in, you're in the middle. And I know it's a simple overstatement, but there is no better position to be in an economy that's being driven by data than to be in the mix, in the middle of the value chain. You, in theory, have access to and ability to influence your suppliers. And when it comes to data, you have the same in your downstream customers and your customers' customers. And if you can figure out ways to use that data to do these types of, all I've done on this circle here is start to identify some of the ways that data is used to drive economic value, whether it's internal process optimization, licensing the data or selling it to others, using crowdsourcing to augment your data and turn it into something more valuable, or using it to identify add-on services or new products that you can be bringing to market. You sit in the middle of all of this. And so you can short-circuit a bunch of the other mind-blowing questions of how to apply exponentials and how to shift your business model to operate more effectively and how to drive new value from innovation simply by saying, how can we access and monetize data? I'm sure that's not lost on anyone, but I would say start there. Once you've figured out the behaviors you're trying to drive in the market, start with the question of data. How are you going to make money from the data that you should have a right to own and use as the quote-unquote new oil? So one of the challenges that we hear from our clients all the time is, okay, you tell us you can't do the quote-unquote below-the-line stuff, going back to my first chart. You can't do the below-the-line stuff, you can't do above-the-line stuff with your below-the-line resources. What do? How do you set up a structure to go and take advantage of these opportunities? And the best answer, with perhaps a goofy name that I have and that we have so far, is to set up a digital foundry. Call it whatever you want. But the basic notion is to co-locate certain specialists whose job should be to constantly be thinking about human behavior and how to impact human behavior and how to get insights into the behavior that's going to create the most economic value. Constantly thinking about how to access data and turn it into something valuable, and constantly trying digital prototypes to get all this stuff into the market. And those are just a few of the specialist resources you need. It doesn't need to be a huge team, but it does need to be a team that's at the service not only for any of your corporations overall, because it should be exploring the place that business units are not directly aimed at, but it should also be the resource for those businesses to come and say, I'm shit scared. I don't know what I'm going to do to take advantage of these technologies. I can't sort it out. Can you help me? And when they're deployed effectively, digital foundries can get the job done way better than anyone in your existing operations. So I am almost out of time, which is disappointing because there's another great story out there about Michelin. Many of you probably know it. The punchline behind this is Michelin is a big rubber round thing manufacturer. Always has been. But they've built an amazing system around their access to data based on that rubber. That started with a very simple insight, a behavioral insight. And the behavioral insight was no one actively monitors their tire pressure. And on account of that, they don't take advantage of all the fuel savings that can come from keeping your tires inflated. We happen to own the tire. I wonder if we can help them with that. And so in the first iteration of what they ended up developing, something called FE tires, they were able to set up a data flow by putting sensors in the tires, a data flow about the level of tire inflation that would allow truck fleet managers and truck operators to understand when their tires were becoming deflated and when it was time to inflate them and the punchline and the important thing was to increase fuel efficiency. They got into that business and suddenly this thing took off, where they started to be known not just as the interesting smart tire manufacturers, but the partner to help me manage the fuel consumption in my truck fleet. And so they started layering on other services to as it says here, to get into, quote unquote, eco-driving. So they would offer tips on how to drive more eco-friendly, how to make sure that you're doing everything when you drive to make sure you're minimizing fuel consumption. And that then became known as FE fuel. And that then bought them the opportunity to get into something that they now call FE trailers. Now, Michelin, the provider of a single component, and FE trailers, by the way, is about optimizing the use of the trailers that are attached to the trucks that have the tires on them. But now, Michelin, the company that makes rubber round things, owns the truck and the truck usage information. And so they now have an entire business called Michelin Solutions that is centered on FE fuel that drives all this economic value, both for themselves and for their downstream customers, and it started with a single, simple behavioral insight. So that's what I got. I thought I'd end on this not because it's just a completely overused but still true quote, but I was personally amused to find out that actually, apparently Darwin didn't say this. I can't tell you who did. Steve Shepley, one of my colleagues, knows. But I'd love, if anyone does know that, catch me at a break and let me know what you think. I hope this was helpful. I hope, if nothing else, as you go through the next few days, you reflect back on how to peel away all the complexity and all the fog of opportunity to identify just a few things that you can then take back to your businesses and take action on when you leave Boston in a few days. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to chatting over breaks and in various different meals.